Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the ScheerPost YouTube channel. My name is Diego Ramos. I'm the managing editor at SP. And today, my colleague Max Jones and I will be interviewing ScheerPost's own columnist, Patrick Lawrence. If you aren't familiar with his work, he spent almost 30 years abroad as a foreign correspondent and has written for a number of publications, including The New Yorker, the International Herald Tribune, The Nation, Consortium News, and of course, us. In this interview, we will discuss one of Patrick's latest columns for ScheerPost titled Journalists on Journalist Crime, which covers a broad array of stories that insidiously connect to the overall state of the media, including Tucker Carlson's Fox News ousting, Mehdi Hasan's Matt Taibbi confrontation on MSNBC, and the mainstream media's hand in the manhunt for the Pentagon leak suspect Jack Teixeira. So enjoy the show and make sure to keep coming back to the ScheerPost YouTube channel for future interviews with Patrick and other guests. Hi, Patrick. Thanks for coming on again. Appreciate you taking the time.
It's nice to see you both.
Yeah, nice to see you too. It's we're in a particularly unique period, I think, in history in regards to history and journalism, media. I had seen the connections between all the stories you neatly put together in your column, as a bigger commentary of the state of the media. And if people want to check this out, it's called Journalists on Journalist Crime at ScheerPost. And it's interesting because if I had used the standards in history presented to me in journalism school, I think I ought to be up in arms about what's been happening with these stories. But of course, this has been apparent to me for a while, and I think all of us here.
Yeah. And all right, did you want to say something, Patrick?
I profess in journalism schools here and there, or I have until the pandemic. I'm very curious what you get taught in J school, because my own teaching career actually may be on the decline, let's say, because of my associations with ScheerPost, Consortium, and so forth, right? But anyway, maybe we can touch on that in time. Uh, I think, between the time of that column and our time together here this morning, we've had this new development, the Durham report uh, on John Durham's investigation into the Russiagate nonsense. And we were watching Glenn Greenwald presentation last night. He's a constitutional law, trained as a constitutional lawyer, so he's rather good on all sorts of questions that have to do with legal matters. And this whole report is being absolutely buried in the mainstream press. And I mention this at the outset of our exchange because I agree with you, Diego. We are in a moment of some historical magnitude, let's say. And the burying of history is not something any of us should take lightly. This kind of thing happens in various kinds of societies, and to live in a condition where one's history is obliterated is a terrible thing. I've seen it in Guatemala, for example, in China. And I take this with the utmost seriousness because of the responsibility it confers on independent media, on people such as yourselves, uh, to keep the record alive, let's say. Uh, uh, I can't stress, I cannot overstress the gravity of this and the responsibility we bear, uh, because at the moment, the entire Russiagate nonsense hoax is being buried. This was a very grave moment in American history when a major political party, the law enforcement institutions, the spooks, and the press subverted an election, subverted our political process. We cannot let this uh, be interred in the history books. I suppose
Yeah.
that's my starting point this morning, right? You know,
Yeah, great starting point. And related to our next question in a way, regarding the state of the media. We wanted to start off talking about asking you about Tucker's ousting from Fox News, Tucker Carlson's ousting from News, and a little bit about him and what this means for dissident voices in mainstream media.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so, the success, I think, of Tucker's show indicates that there's a craving among the public, I think, for anti-establishment dissident voices. Much like the rise of Bernie Sanders and Trump, I think represented. But even someone as Tucker, who brought great success to a corporation, is removed and ousted because the discourse has become, I think, well, we can't say for sure why he was removed, I guess, but we can maybe assume or uh, hypothesize about if it's because the discourse has become so homogenized. So do you think that there will be a
mm.
point where corporations are forced to kind of reckon with the public's craving for anti-establishment voices, coming into conflict with their own political goals and desire to
Mm.
homogenize the discourse?
Um, I'm just about to publish a book taking up these kind of questions. So, thanks. Um, uh, a few months ago, the New York Times ran a marketing campaign, the slogan of which was independent journalism for independent living. Wait a minute. The New York Times is putting itself across as a manifestation of independent journalism. Preposterous. But it tells us something, right? I always like to use things as a mirror. What does that tell us? It tells us that independent journalism is an important notion for a sufficient number of Americans, such that the New York Times has to pose as an independent publication, right? Um, so it was perverse, but there's a lesson to be drawn there, right? Uh, I mentioned this book I'm about to bring out. In it, I argued that the extent to which mainstream media um, begin to conduct themselves with more integrity, uh, if they do at all, and I don't have a lot of, I don't, I'm with a lot of other people who don't have much hope for that. But to the extent they do, it will be because independent publications either inspire or require them uh, to report, publish, broadcast uh, more accurate, a more accurate reflection of our realities. That's
Yeah,
where, I mean, this. This is
So
another way of
independent,
saying,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, the dynamism of our profession lies in independent publications. I'm quite sure of that. Now, in the matter of Tucker Carlson, Max, you made a very good point. I came back from nearly 30 years as a correspondent abroad in 2010. And even before I got home, I detected quite clearly that a goodly number of Americans are eager, as I like to put it, eager on the way to desperate for a new story of ourselves, you know, a more realistic accounting of how we conduct ourselves, who we are, who we have been, right? I thought that was a very good thing. Um, the mainstream media are not delivering that new story, but I think you're quite correct that a lot of Americans still uh, await it. Um, we have to be careful about one thing. I've heard a few people uh, pronounce on the Tucker Carlson case um, and suggest implicitly that Tucker Carlson will never be counted as an independent journalist because he's a conservative. Stop right there. Independent journalism does not imply any given political stripe, right? We can't say you're not a lefty, so you can't be an independent journalist, right? I've heard this several times. So that's why I'm bringing it to the attention of your viewers, right? It's nonsense. First, well, I should say parenthetically, left and right. These terms have no interest for me at all anymore. In the American context, they don't mean very much. Um, I started my career at the left-hand end of the garden. That's so, but but we're in a different world now, and the Tucker case. The column that brings us together this morning, Diego. The comment thread was really interesting. Um, there were a number of people who started their comments by saying, "Well, I've never actually seen Tucker Carlson's show, comma, but you know." And then hold forth on their opinions about Tucker Carlson, right?
Right,
Doesn't work that way. We have
right.
to be very careful. Independent journalism is about multiplicity. Uh, I don't want to. I don't want to see. I don't want to see independent publications inherit inherit the liberal intolerance that's basically suffocating us at this point.
Right. And
But
it's it's interesting you mentioned that. It's interesting that you put in your column this American prospect piece that basically just says Tucker is this all these terms that you throw out, crypto Nazi, all these kind of just nothing terms that,
weird.
you know, are used generally in this discourse. I don't know if you saw, but there was actually a piece, I believe, written before that, um, in the American Prospect as well by Lee Harris and Luke Goldstein, and they talk about Tucker in kind of the same way you do, where they say, he has this willingness and the ability to challenge the mainstream narratives and critique elites and policies and things that other network
Yeah,
shows wouldn't dare
Kara,
do.
Kara brought that piece to my attention.
Yeah,
Uh,
and
and
yeah,
apparently, after American Prospect published it, they got no end of grief for that. And in consequence, they put out this other piece of rubbish, right? The one I mentioned. Yeah,
Right.
well spotted.
And David Dayen, the executive editor, also came out with a statement that essentially throws these writers under the bus and says, it's a pretty long statement, but he says, I don't think we quite got there with this story. So it shows that even in independent media, if you step over a certain line and your readers get upset, you kind of just capitulate to them, despite having a sensible article, in my opinion. I mean, what Harrison Goldstein saying, what you say, I agree with, and I don't think it's anything crazy. Yet, you receive just a little backlash on Twitter, and you have to kind of, take an entire step back.
Yeah, yeah. I'm concerned as independent media assume greater visibility and responsibilities, in my view, that people operating in these media are properly trained, not only by way of editorial skills, um, but in ethics, right? The the uh, ethics in American discourse now are collapsed. We have the phenomenon of, let's say, instrumentalized reason, right? Reason, rational thinking needs to be conducted without reference to the outcome of the thinking, right?
Yeah.
If you reason leads to belief, that's not me, that's Socrates. If belief leads to reason, that's subjective reasoning. We're in serious trouble. The mainstream media is a mess on this point. American discourse generally is. And I want to see independent publications defend not only history, as I'm making the argument here, but defend proper rational thought and objective reasoning, you know?
Yeah. And speaking of belief leading to reason, I think there's a lot of examples of that in mainstream media as of late. But there's two examples that I have written down here that I think really stand out. Or maybe one of them doesn't so much have to do with that, but says something else about the mainstream media's role in today's political sphere. Like, so even before Tucker was fired from Fox, the NSA was spying on his communications for simply trying to interview the president of a country, which I think, any journalist should be interested in conducting an interview like that. And
he wanted to interview Putin or something.
Yeah. And the corporate media took the NSA's claim, so basically, Tucker made the accusation that that the NSA was spying on that the Biden administration was spying on his team, and then the NSA, disseminated this claim that there was no evidence that they had done that, and then the corporate media took that at face value without investigating it themselves, so they just believed what the NSA said, which is kind of crazy. And then there's also the case of the Ukraine whistleblower Jack Teixeira being literally tracked down by the I think the Washington Post and the New York Times it was, and in that same day he was arrested by the FBI. And so I've only really been following politics for closely for the last few years. So this kind of symbiotic relationship between government and media is like my introduction to mainstream media. So I'm wondering, when did the role of journalists acting as a check on power switched to functionally them becoming the allies of the government.
Mm.
Or was it always like this?
No, it wasn't always like this. I'm not a believer in golden ages, um, but no, it wasn't always like this. My theory is as follows. My observation is as follows. September 11th, 2001 marked a major change in America's circumstances globally and a major change, a major jolt or jilt or something to the American consciousness, right? Until September 11th, we lived for a very long time under the assumption that we were immune from history, right? I like to quote Toynbee, um, writing about his childhood in Edwardian England in a memoir. Hard to find it, but and he says, we always thought history was something unpleasant that happened to other people. We learned on September 11th that history, that we are not immune from history, that all of its sordid features, uh, we are subject to them. This this mythology that we were had exited history goes back to the 1620s when the first settlers came here. Um, and I think apart from this change in our consciousness, remember, do you remember the morning of September 11th and some days afterwards? This constant replaying of the planes going into the towers and the towers collapsing. You could hardly get away from it, right? I looked at that as a kind of objective correlative literary term, meaning an external phenomenon is used to describe an emotional or psychological state, right? Uh, Though that footage was an an objective correlative, what was really collapsing was our idea of ourselves. Okay. Um, Apart from that, uh, I think from that time, the national security state, uh, if you don't mind the term, the empire has been on the defensive. It changed. I count that as the rather peculiarly uh, instantaneous end of the American century. Okay. So I put great stress on 2001. And it's been since then that the media have uh, altered their understanding of their relationship with power. It was at that point, remember, the war on terror was declared and so on, right? I think it was at that point that journalists began to redefine not only their relationships with power, but their very function. Um, I think they understand their function now as an adjunct of the national security state. Um, Now, I trace that to 2001, but 2016, to be precise, July of 2016, when the email leak, not hack, occurred, and Russiagate was suddenly underway. Uh, this this put the phenomenon I'm describing post 2001. We can even talk about post 2001 time, right? The the Russiagate thing just escalated the phenomenon I'm assigning to 2001, right? And at this point, I don't think, you know, the McCarthy period was pretty terrible um, by way of the performance of the press. But I want to make a distinction here. Um, During the McCarthy period, standards of conduct were radically violated, of course. But those standards were still acknowledged as the standards. In other words, they may have been breached, but they weren't pushed aside, right? In our time, uh, the standards of conduct in journalism, it's not a question of breaching them. They've just been pushed aside. The whole mainstream media's understanding of its role has been redefined as
Patrick, does
openly
that mean that there was a
openly in the service of the what?
sorry, or does that mean that there back then there was a recognition that there was a breach among the public, but now there isn't for the most part? Is that what you're saying?
Help me out. Ask me again. I'm not quite sure your question.
Or you said during the McCarthy period that there was that the ethics were breached, but they weren't pushed aside entirely, but now they are. So I'm asking, does that mean that there was a recognition that they were breached by the public, do you mean something else by that?
Uh, you're touching on all these things I go into in this book I keep mentioning. I don't mean to be using our time to hawk my book, but Americans have long nursed a profound need to believe they have a free and independent press. So during the Cold War, when the press uh, uh, allowed the CIA to penetrate its ranks um, and covered things up, buried things, the various coups that began in Tehran in 53, Guatemala City in 54. Uh, um, the public the public averted its eyes. They didn't want to. The public did not want to have to go into the thought that the press was misbehaving. So it was pretty symbiotic then, and I think that's what we're seeing now. I have a lot of friends who watch MSNBC, read the New York Times. If they didn't read it in the New York Times, it didn't happen the way I might suggest it happened. And whatever the New York Times renders by way of an account of this or that event is the way it happened, right? So we have the same thing now. Um, I think what might be different, or among the things that are different now, is that uh, the major dailies, they're basically living on their legacy. They're living on past. I think what's happening now that we might do well to note here is that these papers had reputations reputations for authoritative, reliable coverage um, that were, to one or another degree, earned, deserved. Um, uh, and what's happening now is they are basically consuming their own tails um, because they are living on these legacies, but they're not adding to them. They're living on these legacies while completely destroying the credibility that they had accumulated over a very great many years. Um, and this is also another important uh, factor in the rise of independent media. Are you two aware of the Gallup organization's poll last summer? You got those numbers? The number of Americans who believe what they read in the newspapers, the percentage of Americans.
Yeah.
Wait, let me get this right. 16% of Americans believe what they read in the mainstream dailies. For television, it's 11%. And when I'm lecturing, I always like to turn these numbers upside down to get the full effect. 84 of every 100 Americans don't believe what they read in the mainstream newspapers. And 89 of every 100 Americans don't believe what they hear on television. This is what I mean by these so called legacy media consuming their own legacies without adding anything to them. It can't go on forever, logically. It's a finite supply of credibility. Credibility comes in, it is a finite, what do we call it? It there's a finitude to it. It doesn't, it's not
Yeah.
endless. Okay?
Right.
Let's go on.
Yeah. So just to wrap up here, maybe one final thing we can touch on is in this Jack
Take your
Teixeira
time,
leak.
Diego.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Um, what I found interesting and kind of touching on this idea of this relationship between the government and media, sometimes it's pretty blatant. Like we were saying on MSNBC, a lot of times they'll have people from the FBI, the NSA as guests, and never really challenge anything they say. Everything they say is gold. And in the case of the Jack Teixeira story, with in regards to the reporting by the Times and the Washington Post, they had assistance from Eric Toller, I believe that's how you say his name, from Bellingcat, which, amongst the sort of independent lefties in the media spaces, you'll see that they, it's not a nice relationship between them and Bellingcat, given the fact that they have received funding from the National Endowment for Democracy and these sort of things. So there is a sort of indirect connection to government there. Do you see that playing out more in the future, where we'll see more outfits like Bellingcat, integrated into the media, and people taking these kind of sources as word because it's a sort of greater fight for good or some sort of abstract message like that? And people like Jack Teixeira are dangerous individuals, and you start, like you mentioned, throwing all this rhetoric about racism and looking into shootings and all these things that don't really have to do with the substance itself.
Yeah. Well, I was just remarking on this the other day around the house here. I think the project to penetrate mainstream media, which goes back to the Cold War, um, is considered to be complete. There's nothing more to do. We've back in the 50s, uh, the agency and the national security state uh, would have agents posing as journalists, or journalists, if not on the payroll, working quite closely with them. Um, that's now we're a stage on from that. As you both know, they don't even bother with that stuff anymore, or at least it's not the main event. They just put, they just put generals and spooks on the air, right? So the the corruption of mainstream media, I get the very strong sense, is considered a complete project. The new project is penetrating independent media, right? Um, this is the front edge of what we're talking about effectively as a war. Uh, 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 how do I describe this war against an a principled press and discourse in America, right? Um, for control of the narrative. There you are. This is this is where it is now. Penetration of independent media. I don't want to mention any names because I've had my little go-arounds in this way, and I don't consider myself a vengeful person, but it's going to get pretty heavy going if if I am seeing things correctly, because independent media are not under the control of a national security state, not yet anyway. Um, and this is why the battle on social media is so crucial. Think about it. Think about the way you two do your work and the way I'm published. We're very dependent on digital platforms of one or another sort. Um, and as I mentioned in this book, I keep noting, technologies are not empty vessels. They're not value neutral. Technologies are reflect the the political economy that produce them. And they're manifestations of the political economy that produced them. Okay, so these platforms arose. You know, they're corporations, large ones. They're going to reflect the orthodoxies of the societies that gave rise to them. And this makes independent media quite vulnerable. Not fatally vulnerable, but you know, the publications where I write, what's going to happen if Mark Warner gets his way with this crazy new bill um, outlawing or threatening people who read or view blacklisted publications, um, making use of virtual private networks, VPNs. You know about this law? Uh,
No.
Not
well,
happening.
I don't know where it is I don't know where it is in the pipeline, but Mark Warner proposes. First of all, there is we're going to start having more and more publications blacklisted. Okay, there will come a day when you can no longer look at RT.com. Right, um, and Warner has this bill um, allowing for the prosecution of anyone who views these publications will be accessible, I gather. I'm not Mr. Techie, but through VPNs, virtual private networks. If if someone is discovered making use of a VPN to read a condemned publication, they could get prison terms and fines.
Wow.
What's that about? That's about control of independent media. Again, I don't know where that bill is in the process,
But the fact
it's
that it can even be proposed is kind of speaks to the state that we're in, right?
yes, this is serious business. This is very serious business, and the responsibilities that people such as yourselves, myself in my own modest way, bear. Uh, Look, our resources are not very plentiful. We should not allow that to uh, to cause us to fail to recognize our responsibilities. Our responsibilities, in other words, are way outsized to our resources, but they are our responsibilities anyway. Um, and I hope the wherewithal, let's say, of independent publications grows along with comes to match these responsibilities. It's the future of the profession, if you ask me. You know.
Another, yeah, like, well, just that what you've been speaking about. Another thing comes to mind. I mean, another, I think, a particularly egregious and authoritarian remark by one of America's most influential political figures was when AOC literally called for the government to be able to take off certain shows or networks off the air based on what they say. When she was talking about Tucker Carlson on Jen Psaki's show, it just, and the fact that she can say that on such a big platform. Actually, I don't know how many people watch Jen Psaki's show. It's probably not many, but the fact that she could say that and there's pretty much no backlash from other Democrats or people in politics, it's just pretty amazing that that's so accepted. I think it's because she recognizes accurately that the security state is viewed as, by her political base, the people that like her, as their allies. And it's kind of amazing that you could, I don't know, that you could say something like that, that you could so openly call for censorship and there's no backlash. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you think it can't get worse, Max, somebody like AOC comes along and proves you wrong.
Yeah.
uh, um, look, I remember when Russiagate erupted, right? I wrote this column saying I feel like I have nitrogen sickness or something. Everything is upside down. Uh, the party and the publications that used to stand for civil liberties, uh, to use the 40s expression, coexistence, right? All these things are now the peace, are now the warmongering, censoring, uh, lying party and publications. It struck me as so totally odd. I'm not saying anything. It was strange then. It's it's what we all know now. What is a person like Ocasio-Cortez doing, claiming the politics that she claims? If she still does, I don't know. What is she doing, saying things like that? Right? It's a measure of this gravity of our moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
The enormity of it, Max. You know, going back to Toynbee, nobody wants to think of themselves, uh, or it's very hard to think of one's moment as a passage in history. History is what happened, and it will be what is going to happen. But we're too inside our moment to have an easy time of understanding our moment as a passage in history. And ours is such an enormously important. passage in history. We have to do our best to understand that. And we're living through uh, certainly the decline of our imperial phase, but are we living through the collapse of the so-called American experiment? Could be, right?
Yeah.
Many people I read have absolutely no hope for our future.
Yeah, and do you see this as sort of, what AOC did, and also what Mehdi Hasan did with Matt Taibbi, as sort of, I mean, I don't mean to get way out into the weeds here, but as
Go ahead.
either a deliberate attempt to silence these people, or more so this kind of tattletale in the classroom, like, teacher, please look at me doing the right thing, and look at this person, not going according to the rules. I mean, even the headline by MSNBC for that Taibbi piece with Hassan says Mehdi Hassan just lit the Twitter files on fire. Was Congress listening? And as you detail in your
Yeah,
article, Congress was listening. So what do you think of that?
I think there's a lot of childishness around. You're quite right to point that out. But I think this is way more serious than and way more systematic than getting a gold star on your forehead, right? It. I think we're looking at uh, the various manifestations. You know, people like Mehdi Hassan is a hack, right? Uh, Ocasio Cortez is a clownish figure, right? Uh, but I think we are coming face to face with the profound illiberality of that lay at the core of American liberalism from the very first. Okay, de Tocqueville, 190 years ago, warned us against what he called soft despotism. These liberals uh, uh, are behaving in a frighteningly despotic fashion, right? Apple pie authoritarianism. That's what we're being served. And I, I'm a little older than you two. Right? I developed during the Cold War a particular contempt for a figure known as the Cold War liberal, right?
Mm.
Very insidious bunch of people. Uh, and it, it struck me then, I couldn't have articulated it as carefully as I can now. It struck me then that fundamentally, America is in many ways an extremely intolerant nation. And this does not, intolerant, there are a lot of good people in America. No, I'm not saying otherwise, but intolerant in terms of the, the, the imperative to observe the orthodoxy, conformity. We are, I'm not the first to say, de Tocqueville beat me by 2 centuries. The power of conformity in this country is, is unmatched anywhere, if you ask me. Um, and so I think it's way beyond virtue signaling. If that's all it were, you could brush these people aside, but it's not, Diego. This is, you know, I when Donald Trump arose as a national political figure, and we had the liberal reaction to him, my immediate sense was Trump will come, Trump will go. But these liberals and their intolerance are not going to go. Um, they are going to be the stubborn, long-term threat to our democratic process, our public discourse, and what have you. Yeah.
Yeah. And if we have
Are
time to
you with
ask one
me
more,
on that? Are you with me on that thought, or what?
which thought exactly that the liberals are?
That
Yeah, go ahead.
American liberalism, I think, is the most worrisome feature uh, of of our political sphere right now.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
intolerance.
yeah, absolutely. I think that. Well, I think that it's kind of a crazy shift because, I mean, I was a child, so I don't remember too much, but I remember just from hearing my parents talk about politics when I was a kid that it was the conservatives that were the more authoritarian leaning when I was, after the or during the war on terror and things like that. They were the ones that were in favor of the Patriot Act and the Iraq War. And well, actually, a lot of liberals were in
That's
favor of the Iraq War and the Patriot Act as well. But it was mainly conservatives. But now it's like the liberal class has become so authoritarian in their beliefs and so openly despotic and
yeah,
willing to attack civil liberties. I mean, and like one example is of someone that I heard about and watched a lot because my parents liked him was when I was a kid was Jon Stewart, and he was known as one of the more courageous people that was speaking out against the war on terror, I believe, right? And when the Twitter files came out, I don't. I maybe he reported on them, but as far as I know, he didn't say anything about the substance of the Twitter files, namely that there's a censorship apparatus being developed between corporate America and the government, which is like just the definition of fascism, right? And he didn't report on that. But then when Mehdi Hasan came out with this kind of hit piece, interview on Taibbi and pointed out two mistakes. One was a date, one was a typo. He applauded Mehdi Hasan as being some kind of courageous journalist, and that was something that really, just like that little anecdote right there, along with things like what we've already talked about, like AOC going on Jen Psaki's show and literally advocating for the government to censor certain shows based on what ideologies they espouse. That to me marked a shift of like, oh wow, the role of American liberalism has shifted so much and in such a dangerous way. It's yeah. So I absolutely agree with you there. I don't know,
let me
Diego, did you want to say something? Oh yeah.
let me offer
Yeah.
a theory before you go, Diego. Let me offer a theory here. Okay, when the Berlin Wall came down and the decade of American triumphalism began, we had this book, The End of History and the Last Man, right? Fukuyama. Remember? Now, the thesis was American neoliberalism, market economy, uh, supported by, there are two kinds of democracy, coming back to Jefferson and Hamilton. There's popular and elite, supported by an elite democracy. This was it. It was the crowning achievement of humanity. There was no place else left to go. Okay. Uh, um, I'm, I'll leave that there, assuming you know what I'm getting at, right? Now, the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton, um, was supposed to follow on from Obama, of course, and that was supposed to be the ultimate consolidation of liberalism's end of history triumph. When Clinton lost, it was not merely a candidate losing, it was a whole worldview. It was a whole notion of how the universe works. It was suddenly history hadn't ended. Holy smokes, right? And I think that's why that was the moment when American liberals went right off the rails because their very deeply held convictions about their place in history tipped over. And I think ever since they are trying to claw that back. And at this point, so far as one can make out, um, they are willing to do anything to keep their candidate in office. That's my
Yeah.
theory.
Yeah.
Diego, I interrupted you.
No, no, no worries. But to answer your question from before, I do think so as well that liberals represent this force because I mean they masquerade as the good in America. It's always this either or kind of situation, and the Republicans are always painted as the evil, and the Democrats, especially with this big base of blue no matter who kind of out to brunch liberals who will vote for any kind of person that represents these values, I think is extremely dangerous because uh, it inherently takes away all nuance from what they do. And even though there isn't much difference a lot of the time with Republicans in terms of their voting records and what they advocate for, and it's also worrying because they have this grasp on. I feel like I mean even though the 2016 election and the 2020 election was pretty close, and there was large numbers of people. I feel like most people's in the kind of circles that I am exhibit this blue no matter who attitude because it's so simple and they have other things to worry about in life. They have jobs, they have family, all these things that and as compared to someone like me who is obviously it's my job to look into the nuances of these things. It's they make it so easy for people to just say, okay, Trump, orange, Hitler, I can't do that, so just got to stick with Biden, Hillary, Obama, all these people. And I
Yeah.
think that's way more dangerous to the
We're, we're,
discourse.
we're already getting the lesser of two evils rhetoric, if you haven't
Yeah.
noticed, right?
Hmm.
And that expression, blue no matter who, I mean, the implications of that are just so stupid and almost shocking. That someone could, uh, I would say someone could think that way, but it's the very definition of not thinking, right? Someone who could, totally weird. I don't vote, by the way. I don't care, but I wouldn't put my name on this political process for anything in the world, right?
And it's amazing because Patrick, like and Diego, what you guys have been saying, their desire to get their candidate in office makes them completely not care about it. Huge store. I mean, like the Twitter files. Oh, okay. Well, we'll wrap this up. But one last thing. The Twitter files. Yeah. Like the fact that we Diego and I went to USC. Diego graduated last year. I was still there this year, and the fact that I can talk to students in Annenberg, which is the journalism school, and most people either don't know what the Twitter files are, or if they've heard about them, it's
They
usually
don't even know they're journalism students, and they don't know.
that they either don't know what the Twitter files are, or if they do know, it's like a very that thing that Elon Musk did to get back at the old Twitter regime or whatever. It speaks to how this liberal journalism has become so much more about activism, to the extent where when a story is revealed that the government and corporate America are working together to censor the internet and basically dictate the flow of information, it's to them it doesn't matter because it's not helping their candidate get in office. It's quite amazing. But yeah, I'll end it at that.
Yeah,
And if you want to say anything, go ahead.
yeah. No, good to talk to you both again. Uh, and
Yeah.
on we go. Thanks for having me on. Right.
All right.
Thanks
Thank you,
so much,
Patrick.
Patrick.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Next time. Next time. Okay.